Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our F1 2026 team previews. We have three more teams coming your way here in this video. That is Haas, Aston Martin, and wrapping it all up, VCARB here for this week. It is super fun. We are going to be beginning with Haas, so you know I had to break out the only Haas team merch that I own, from which I believe is 2022. So big ups. I definitely need some new merch, but as my resident Haas fan in the community, you know I had to come and represent. We're going to be kicking it off things with Haas. We're going to go over a handful of things the similar things that we saw last week when we covered the first three teams on the grid, and I, for one, am looking forward to it. The 2026 season is only but a few weeks away, with preseason testing just around the corner. We are going to be having a lot of fun. Without further ado, without beating around the bush, let's go ahead, hop on into this thing, and talk about Toyota Gazoo Racing Haas F1 team. Let's go ahead and get this three-team preview underway with Haas F1 team, or TGR Haas F1 team. MoneyGram officially exiting the Formula One space, being replaced by a larger portion by Toyota in the Haas F1 program. So that'll come up here a little bit as we cover the Haas F1 team, but nonetheless, let's go ahead and kick things off. We have Haas up first in this video. They finished 8th in the Constructors in 2025. It was a bit of a tale of two halves of the season, as well as two halves of a season from both sides of the garage. You had Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman making up our driver lineup for this very much a midfield team here on the grid. I think they've securely put themselves as a midfield team, to say the least. I mentioned before, Ollie Behrman and Esteban Ocon make up the driver lineup, obviously giving us a good balance between experience and youth. We've touched on experience versus youth in the past and previous teams, and I think this is another good example of having one driver who's been in this sport for a long time, or at least relatively speaking, on the grid, as well as a younger driver in Ollie Behrman, who has had one full season under his belt and a couple of race sessions in his pocket from seasons before that. So all in all, it is a relatively balanced lineup. Obviously, you have the experience of Esteban Ocon with the raw speed of Ollie Behrman as well. I think they both showed very good flashes in 2025, and I'm hoping that they'll take a step forward as we move on to 2026. Excuse me. In terms of the number one driver, I think this actually might be more of an open competition than people might want to admit. I think it's pretty clear that they want Esteban Ocon to sort of step into that role, provide a solid foundational piece. But as I mentioned in the opening for this segment, Haas had very much a tale of two halves of the season. Last season, you had the first half of the season, which Esteban Ocon absolutely rocked it. He had a very good run in the beginning of the season, scoring some really, really good points, but sort of faded as the season went on. And then on his counterpoint, Ollie Behrman had a relatively rough start to the season, showed a lot of flashes, but really struggled with consistency. And then in the back half of the season, really started to turn it on, culminating in a P4 in Mexico and a very good finish to the 2025 season. So in terms of number one driver, this might be more of an open competition than some people might want to admit. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens this season. In terms of internal dynamics or pressure points, I think this is kind of exactly what I just mentioned. Ollie Behrman is obviously the young driver, the rookie or sophomore driver now going into his second full season in Formula One. But at the same time, he finished 2025 on such a higher note than Esteban Ocon did. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how that dynamic goes when it comes to starting this new era of regulations. Obviously, Esteban Ocon has been around for longer, been around the sport more in terms of these, era regulation turnover points. And so it's going to be very interesting to see which one can kind of get on top of the car quicker. I've heard rumor that actually this new car might behave a little more like the older F2 cars might have. And so it's actually very interesting, Ollie having obviously just made the jump from F2 to F1, to see if that gives him any potential leg up on Esteban Ocon as the season gets going. So I, for one, will be watching that like a hawk. No doubt about it. Now, in terms of who is expected to lead development, it's obviously has to be Esteban Ocon. I mentioned he's been around in more eras of regulations. He's been around teams and mechanics and building cars the longest. And so I think while Ollie will provide a lot of really good input, I think this is definitely going to fall on Esteban's shoulders primarily to sort of identify the weak points of the car and try and get the car sorted out as quickly as possible. So seems pretty straightforward to me there. All right, let's move on now towards our big question heading into 2026 for Haas F1 team. I think the single biggest unknown for the team is going to be, can they get off on this new regulation set on the right foot? I think we saw at the beginning of the last era of regulations, the ground effects regulations we just left behind in 2022, not necessarily poorly, but at the same time, it was with, I think, a driver lineup that was not necessarily the right ones to get the most out of the car, as well as lead the development direction long term. And so I think it took a long couple of years to sort of get the car in a good window and have the drivers behind it to sort of drive development. And you can't really afford that when you're going into a new era of regulations, right? If you can get off to a good start, you can really then build on it and start to put yourself in the position you dream of when it comes to it being a few years into the regulations. Instead of playing catch up, you're having other teams catch up to you. So I think the big question for Haas, especially with the integration of Toyota Gazoo Racing, as I mentioned at the top, I think it's going to be very interesting to see if they can manage to get off on the right foot. I think Toyota coming in last season, I'm hoping that the experience in racing that they have brought in will be paying very big dividends going into 2026. I am hoping and praying as a Haas fan that we get off on the right foot. I think we have a driver lineup that can be very solid in the midfield, and if we can give them a platform to really succeed, I think they can do good things for us. So that is my single biggest question for Haas going into 2026. Now, in terms of what must go right for success, I think the key actually will be the drivers, more so just important as the platform they're driving. I think the drivers are going to play a big factor in this. I think I really want to see Esteban get back to his beginning of 2025 form rather than the ending. And then Ollie, I really want to see continue to build that momentum, take that second year jump in terms of performance, and really hopefully get off on the right foot and get off to a really strong start in 2026. So I think if we can get Esteban Ocon very comfortable with the car and in a window that he enjoys, as well as Ollie Behrman continuing his momentum that he built towards the back half of 2025, I think that must go right for a good 2026, because otherwise you're going to be playing catch up either from a platform perspective or a driver perspective, or worst case scenario, both. All right, on the other side of biggest question, we have our biggest concern, and it goes hand in hand with our biggest question, because our biggest concern is, as the smallest team on the grid, will Haas be able to get off on the new era of regulations on the right foot? You obviously, Haas in the past has been very beholden to the development of Ferrari, obviously being one of, if not the biggest customer team of Ferrari in terms of components and obviously engine. And so it's going to be very interesting to see if they're able to take advantage of whatever package they've been able to develop around a new Ferrari power unit going into the new regulations. And it's going to be very interesting, because if they're having to play catch up, I really think the fact that they are the smallest team on the grid is going to play against them, as it always has. And so the biggest concern is, if you really mess it up from the jump, you're going to be having on a multi-year plan to redirect and navigate these new regulations. And I really am concerned that they haven't necessarily always shown the highest propensity for getting off to a strong start. And so I, for one, am hopeful, but cautiously optimistic, to say the least. But that said, it can't all be concerns. I think the biggest upside when it comes to the 2026 Haas F1 platform, I think it has to be there, in terms of key strength or advantage, I think it is going to come down to two portions. One, I think, is going to be the youth and speed of Ollie Behrman. I think it is very clear that he is considered to be one of the, bright future stars in Formula One. If Haas can able to take advantage of it, I think it'll be a very good partnership for the team, however long Ollie decides to stick with Haas F1 team. I think it is only probably a matter of time. I don't think it's a final destination for a lot of drivers, let alone someone with Ollie Behrman's capacity and future potential. And so it'll be very interesting to see how long he stays in the Haas F1 program. But at the same time, I think they have to keep that under wraps and utilize it to the best of their advantage. as well as I mentioned before, the Toyota Gazoo Racing integration. Obviously, Toyota came on board last season, but now they've obviously taken a big step up, becoming the title sponsor for the Haas F1 team. I think this is going to be a very interesting partnership because obviously we've seen Toyota compete at the highest level in terms of other race series. Think like WEC, for example. Obviously, the Toyotas have had a long and storied history in the World Endurance Championship, so they're going to be bringing a lot of wealth of knowledge and the organizational history that Haas obviously does not have. And so I'm hoping that this will be a partnership that will benefit both sides, obviously giving Toyota another foot in the door in terms of Formula One, and as well as that, giving Haas a wealth of research and knowledge to draw from as they continue to try and develop the car. So in terms of upside, I think that is a big thing. And when we talk about best case performance ceiling for the team this season in terms of on track, I think we relatively could potentially see a consistent point scoring team. I think VCARB from a year ago, always finding themselves in the points, relatively always in position to take advantage of others or mistakes or moments here or there. Relatively momentary peaks, but also probably some lows as well. So I think it'll be a relatively volatile season. But in terms of best case scenario, I think the best case scenario would be that Haas gets off on the right foot and is a consistent point scorer on the grid. All right, let's go ahead and move on to their competitive window and key arrivals going into 2026, as well as this era of regulations as a whole. I think the primary teams that will be fighting this season sort of really is that Audi, Aston Martin, VCARB area. I think this is kind of where we ended up last season, and I could realistically see it once again. I think that's sort of that, not the very back, but sort of that next tier up and above the truly, back of the pack teams. I think these are the teams that you can consistently expect to be scoring points, but also be having weekends where they're necessarily off the pace and struggling at the same time. So I definitely consider them to be a very strong midfield team, but I think they'll definitely primarily be fighting these teams for the Constructors title by the end of 2026. So hopefully they prove me wrong, but at the same time, when it comes to a realistic competitive tier, I think a solid midfield team is kind of where they're existing. Probably that solid upper, if there's such a thing as a lower upper, a lower midfield team, but like the upper end of that lower midfield team, I think that's kind of where we are. And so realistically, that's probably where I see us competing. But at the same time, you never know. We saw P4 in Mexico from Ollie. Who knows what he'll deliver in 2026. But in terms of 2026 being a setup year or a must-deliver year, I think this is going to be a similar sentiment that I talk about in a lot of teams. I think it is definitely a setup year. You obviously have the Toyota integration that's going to be taking a step forward, but then becoming the title sponsor, as well as new era of regulations. And so it is definitely very much a setup year when it comes to Haas F1 team. All right, let's start to wrap up our Haas F1 team preview and talk about our season expectations going into 2026. Talk about their best case scenario. I think they get it. The best case scenario for Haas is that they get the new regs started on the right foot, and Ollie and Esteban consistently battle for points. More than likely the lower half of the points, but hopefully battling for points nonetheless or relatively consistently. Unfortunately, I think you can easily turn that around and talk worst case scenario where they really fail to start the regulations and have a really poor foundation and then spend the entirety of 2026 trying to play catch up to the rest of the field, or at least the teams that managed to get it correct, or at least the most correct over the course of the season. And so I think it's really, we're going to see this, a dichotomy on the grid. It's really those who managed to get it right and those who managed to get it wrong. And I think in terms of worst case scenario, it's obviously a very real possibility that a team does not, interpret the rules and regulations the same way and potentially brings a very poor car to the first few rounds and has to spend 2026 very much on the back foot and playing catch up. Now, when it comes to the most likely outcome, I think the most likely outcome is that Haas will start on a relatively solid foundation. Maybe not, probably not the best, but definitely probably not the worst. I have high expectations for the Toyota integration, and so I think they'll be a season where you'll have a very solid foundation. They'll perform very well at tracks that I think would suit them best, or at least they've had the most historic success, but then also struggle or potentially bad luck elsewhere. And so it's really, I think, going to be a volatile season, as Haas always seems to have, one way or another. And so finally, when it comes to expected constructors finishing, I have them slotted somewhere between the 7th and 9th range. I think they'll be a step above sort of the true bottom of the constructors, but definitely probably not necessarily truly fighting for the best of the rest scenario. And so it's going to be very interesting, but at the same time, that's where I realistically see them finishing. And then finally, our last section for Haas in our previews, our one storyline to watch for all of 2026. And I think our single narrative that we're going to be following the course of the season is, will the Toyota partnership help Haas take a step forward on the grid? And will Haas actually start to rise up the ranks consistently? I think a business and a partnership like Toyota can offer really does raise the bar of expectations for a team like Haas. Obviously, over the last couple of seasons, they've really organized themselves on their own, very much the smallest team on the grid, taking on title sponsors that, you know, they'll take here or there. But at the end of the day, Toyota is one of, if not the premier racing entity in the world. There's definitely a lot of arguments to be made depending on which discipline you're talking about. It is an integration and a partnership that I can only imagine will benefit them in the long run, which is exactly why it's my one storyline to watch in 2026, because it will be fascinating to see if a team like Haas can truly take advantage of a partnership like Toyota at its fullest. So it will be very, very much something to watch. And at the same time, very much along the same lines, in terms of a driver technical or organizational focused storyline to watch, it is 100% a technical storyline to watch with the Toyota Gazoo Racing partnership. They are primed for potential very good technical upgrades, and I think that will really help raise not only their floor, but also their ceiling. So I am very much looking forward to the Haas F1 team season. As a fan of Haas, I beg of them to get off on the right foot, but I'll be there no matter what. So next up, we'll be jumping into Aston Martin, but that wraps up our Haas F1 team preview. All right, let's go ahead and move on now to Aston Martin, who have undergone a bit of a transformation from 2025 to 2026. And so we are going to cover every single thing as we begin now. They finished 7th in the Constructors in 2025. And I think as of right now, they are firmly in the upper midfield, but I think a midfield team nonetheless as we move into 2026. Time will tell. Let's go ahead and get this show on the road and begin with our driver lineup and dynamics. Obviously, their driver lineup remains the same. Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll make up the driver pairing for Aston Martin, the same duo that they trotted out in 2025 and 2024, all the same. In terms of experience, you have one very, very, very experienced driver and one very, very experienced driver. Obviously, they are one of, if probably not one of the most experienced teams on the grid in terms of driver pairing. When it comes to number 1 versus number 2 driver, I think it's pretty clear that Fernando Alonso is the number 1 driver. But at the same time, this feels like a situation where if you asked anyone in the team, they would say either a combination of there is no number 1 driver, or if you really asked and got someone's opinion, you would probably hear that Lance is the number 1 driver, to say the least. So who actually knows? But I think Fernando actually is, but the Lance memes are definitely there when it comes to nepotism, to say the least. In terms of internal dynamics or pressure points, I think this is actually probably one of the more make or break seasons. Definitely for at least one of them, if not both drivers, in terms of staying on the grid. I think Fernando Alonso is probably one really, really bad year away from maybe potentially retiring from Formula One full time. And I am always convinced that we're like a bad weekend away from a Lance Stroll retirement announcement. So who really knows what is going to happen there? But I think in terms of pressure points, you have two drivers, one of which is the oldest on the grid by far, always seemingly one moment away from retirement, and another driver who is there for other reasons, and we'll just leave it at that. And then in terms of who is expected to lead development, obviously of these two, the answer is, of course, Adrian Newey. Obviously, I think it's really very much an Adrian Newey or bust type of movement right now in Aston Martin. They obviously pushed extremely hard to get Newey in the fold, and I think he will definitely be handed basically free reign to do whatever he wants with this car, no exceptions. All right, let's move on now to our biggest question for Aston Martin in 2026. And I think it's a very similar one to the Haas preview we just had. I think it is very clear that the biggest question in 2026 for Aston Martin is Adrian Newey going to be the fix-all that everyone has assumed that he is going to be going forward? Obviously, he's taken a big step up in responsibility, as not only within a Formula One team itself, but across the entire organization of Aston Martin. They have gone full in on the Newey experiment, handing him basically the reins of the entire team, and it's going to come out on his shoulders whether or not they can truly compete on the Formula One grid. So the biggest question heading in is Adrian Newey going to be the holy grail that Aston Martin is propping him up to be? Or will other things get in the way and maybe not necessarily deliver to the point that many are expecting him to? So time will tell for that. Now, in terms of what must go right for the team to have success, I think obviously the answer is the combination of the tanking they took in 2025, obviously devoting a lot of resources to 2026 and the development of the new regulations, but also Adrian Newey. I think that combination is going to be extremely important and must go right for them to have success here in 2026. Can they get it right? Will the tanking be worth it, as they not only contributed resources, but also banked wind tunnel time and those other simulator times that are dependent on where you are in the constructors, that sort of time and development as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see. And you definitely are if it's going to go right, they have to nail it, and they have to be battling at the front immediately. All right, let's go ahead and move on now to our biggest concerns for Aston Martin in 26. And I think it's the same place we just left off. You're going to be hearing it a lot. This is one of those teams and situations that I think it really comes down to a single linchpin. Is Adrian Newey going to be able to deliver to the level that the expectations are being placed upon him? I mean, he is effectively running the Aston Martin F1 team. And while that is obviously very important when it comes to developing the car and getting eyes on it and being able to make these decisions, at the same time, a lot more responsibility now falls on Adrian Newey when it comes to the team-wide things at the same time. So is he going to be up to potentially running an entire F1 team and developing a car all at the same time with a driver lineup where one almost always has a foot out the door and another who rarely looks like he wants to be there? So time will tell. And I think the most likely failure point, if things go wrong, is actually going to be in car development. If they make a gamble, go down a path, I think it would look very similar to the Mercedes of the previous regulation era. In 2022, they came with a zero-pod design. Ultimately, it looked good from them in the beginning. It looked good in the simulator, but ultimately did not work out for them in the long run. If that sort of thing happens at Aston Martin, it could spell very much a big disaster time for Aston Martin. So time will tell. But that said, when it comes to biggest upside for Aston Martin, we're going to say his name again. Adrian Newey has about as good a track record in developing cars as you could possibly have, potentially maybe even in F1 history. He has developed some of the winningest cars on the grid, and I think that history is obviously not without merit. And so it's going to be very interesting to follow this season, and it's going to be very, very fun to watch. I think if he is able to deliver Aston Martin a car that can compete, he has at least one driver which has shown that he's able to take advantage, and another which rarely sometimes decides to show up and will look pretty good, but then look just extremely disinterested every other time. So it's definitely going to be, it feels like it's going to be a feast or famine type of development track for Aston Martin. And their biggest upside is that they have a guy at the helm who has a track record of doing just that. So it will be very much, very, very fun to follow, to say the least. And then, and in terms of best case performance ceiling, if I can speak, definitely a consistent upper point scoring position is definitely on the cards here. We're talking potentially finishing P7, P7, 6, 5, maybe even a fourth occasionally. Potentially standing on the podium every once in a while, sort of thing. Obviously, Adrian Newey will have to have worked his magic off the rip. But at the same time, I think this is definitely what Aston Martin we're building for in 2025. And so it's going to get interesting to follow. I keep saying it, but it really is. If everything goes according to plan, their best case scenarios, they're going to see a very similar start to what we saw when Fernando first joined Aston Martin, where he's finishing on the podium consistently, finishing well inside the points, and scoring really, really well over the course of the season. So time will tell. Now, as we take a look forward to their competitive window and key rivals, I think their primary teams that they'll be fighting, at least at the beginning of the season, and so I'm going to play it a little safe and say they'll be fighting them all season long, is going to be VCARB, Williams, the Haas. I think they'll find themselves in that window more often than not, and that might come down more so than it just being the first year of regulations. I think it'll be very interesting to cover this sort of topic in the 2027 season previews. More so than now. It's just there's so many question marks with the development track and the new era of regulations, what the engine is going to be in the back, things like that. It's going to get very interesting to see which teams come out on top to begin the season. But realistically, I think those will probably be the primary teams they're fighting. Obviously, if everything goes well, that will definitely change. But I think the easiest call to make right now is that's realistically kind of the area that they're looking into. As we move on to their realistic competitive tier, upper midfield definitely feels like where they'll slot in more than likely. Definitely sort of in maybe the Williams position that we saw in 2025. Consistently scoring really good points, occasionally having the very good finish, and finding themselves pretty well and clear from the rest of the midfield, but maybe not necessarily fully catching up to the upper class of the grid. So we'll see where they end up. And then in terms of, is 2026 a setup year or a must-deliver year? It honestly is a setup year with some strong implications of must-deliver. They, very similarly to Alpine, tanked a lot of 2025. Obviously, they had a foundation that was still pretty good, and so they did end up finishing 7th in the Constructors. But at the same time, it was very clear that 2026 was always in sights, or at least in the on their mind every single race weekend. And so it's going to be very interesting to see, very interesting to follow. And I think it is definitely a setup year, but definitely with a strong air of must deliver as well. Let's go ahead and talk season expectations and some minor predictions. In terms of best case scenario, I think we see Aston Martin deliver relatively strongly to start the season, bag a lot of really good points, and coming off the back of some Adrian Newey development paths, finish very, very strongly and consistently scoring points, occasionally getting the really, 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 really good results, but more often than not, I think a very consistent point score, definitely rising above the rest, potentially finishing around the 5th position in the Constructors. On the flip side, when it comes to the worst case scenario, I do think the Adrian Newey effect is real, and I think that the development focus that they put over the course of the 2025 season is going to pay dividends. The real question marks, I'm going to choose to believe they get ironed out more often than not. I think a lot of the question marks that I have are more centered around things they realistically can't control in the immediacy, that realistically being the engine that they're putting in the back of their car. And so time will tell to see what that looks like. But ultimately, I think worst case scenario, if that really does hold them back, I still see them taking advantage enough of the aero development side, the efficiency side, and potentially finishing maybe even as low as 8th. Ultimately, I think their most likely outcome is sort of around 6th, but obviously there's some plus or minus in there. And if I was to put it in a range, I think 5th to 8th is a pretty solid guess to see where Aston Martin finishes in 2026. And then, of course, let's go ahead and talk about the one storyline to watch, and it's the storyline that we've been following since the start of the 2025 season. What does an Adrian Newey-led team look like? Obviously, he has thrived in the background at teams like Red Bull, which he just left, and it is going to be quite fun to follow what a Newey-led team looks like, more so than a Newey-developed car might look like. Obviously, he is now in the position of power, so he's going to have the power to make these decisions more quickly and efficiently than ever. Will that lead to a fast car? Time will tell, and we'll follow it over the entire course of the 2026 season, to say the least. And then in terms of a driver technical or organizational focus for this season is 100% a technical focus. It is Newey time, baby. And guys, that wraps up our Aston Martin team preview here in 2026. I said the words Adrian Newey a lot, but realistically, that is what we're expecting in 2026. I think we're going to get a lot of insight into what that's going to look like, and I, for one, can't wait to see it. All right, we've come to our third and final team on this preview here for the 2026 season. It is VCARB, RB, Racing Bulls, whatever they want to be called these days. It's really kind of hard to tell. I think VCARB is still technically correct, so we'll go with that to say the least. They did end up finishing 6th in the 2025 Constructors standings, behind the results of Isaac Hadjar and primarily Liam Lawson, with 2 races from Yuki Tsunoda as well. So a very, very strong season from VCARB, as well as you would kind of expect. I think they realistically were consistently moving forward year over year in the last regulation era, culminating in last season where they got a lot of really, really good results, including a Isaac Hadjar podium at one point. So definitely not too shabby for them. Now, when it comes to the overall team direction, I think if you asked me a year ago, I would have said a very strong midfield team. But going into 2026, I think it actually is much more of a rebuild than some people might like to imagine. There have been a lot of organizational changes in Red Bull, especially over the offseason as well as last season. And so it is going to be very interesting to see what happens with them. But I think this is a bit of a rebuild, primarily because they no longer have a very experienced driver in the sister team. This is going to be the first time where the most experienced driver is only going to have had a season, call it 2 seasons total, and another driver who's just coming off of a 6th place finish in the F2 championship. So very, very fun, very excited to see what happens at VCARB in 2026. But let's go ahead and get this party started with our driver lineup, as we have with every other team we've covered so far. It is, in fact, Liam Lawson and Arvid Lindblad. Obviously, the departure of Yuki Tsunoda from the Red Bull family, or at least the active Red Bull driver lineup, opens the door for a rookie in Arvid Lindblad, who, as I mentioned, finished 6th in the F2 championship last season, takes the step forward to join the second team under the Red Bull Racing organizational structure. So congratulations to him, as well as Liam Lawson retaining his seat here in VCARB. In terms of experience versus youth, I think this is definitely a young with a young driver with a sprinkling of a driver with some sophomore experience. Obviously, Liam Lawson has had a bit of a turbulent start to his Formula One career, but I think this will be the good first full season in a single car that will realistically be able to be developed by him, around him, as well as just sort of settle into some stability, or at least whatever form of stability you can get in the Red Bull organization. So it is definitely going to be a younger driver lineup, but at the same time, if you're going to be a Red Bull junior team, it definitely should, I think, be that way. When it comes to the clear number 1 or number 2, I think this will be a Liam Lawson is the number 1, but at the same time, who really knows when it comes to VCARB? If Arvid Lindblad comes in and absolutely dominates, I think they will be very quick to shift focus off of Lawson, who I still think they do have high hopes for, onto Lindblad, who might potentially be the next driver up for the Red Bull team. We've seen single-year jumps by Isaac Hadjar. I think we'll see what happens, as we know Red Bull is an interesting organization to drive for. So we will keep an eye on that and see how that develops over time. When it comes to internal dynamics or pressure points, I think this is going to be an interesting year for them. As I mentioned, it is the first time we've seen VCARB sort of fall back onto that true development team angle. I think over the course of the last handful of years, we've seen them consistently have effectively Yuki Tsunoda, who has a more than a few years under his belt on the grid, and was able to bring that experience to the team and sort of help them take a step forward. This will be a fascinating thing to follow, to see how much of a step back they potentially take now that they are falling back on the old laurels of taking Red Bull Juniors and seeing how they perform on the grid against these other teams. So in terms of internal pressure points, I think it's going to be very interesting to follow and see what happens with that dynamic over the course of the season. And then finally, who's expected to lead development? I think it's very clearly Liam Lawson, who now actually has experience not only in VCARB, but also with at least a couple of races under his Red Bull belt as well. All right, let's talk biggest questions for 2026. I think the big question that I have for them is, will they be able to score consistent points with the loss of someone like a Yuki Tsunoda as well as Isaac Hadjar? Obviously, last year, I think Hadjar was definitely one of the more consistent drivers on the grid. There was obviously a few races here or there where he really showed his rookie colors, but more or less, I think we saw a very, very consistent and good season by Hadjar, which earned him the promotion up to the main team. Will they be able to deliver those sort of performances with someone like Liam Lawson as well as a true rookie in Arvid Lindblad? I'm not quite sure. I think we saw a lot of roller coasteriness from Liam Lawson, and then you integrate a true rookie in that as well. And I think it'll get very interesting to say the least. But I, for one, am very excited to follow it, to say the least. So in terms of what must go right for success, I think Lawson needs to get back on his solid results streak, and as well as Lindblad being faster than potentially advertised. And then obviously you can make this argument for any team, but having a very good foundation underneath them in terms of the car performance as well. So they obviously get the benefit of sharing of developmental program with Red Bull. Maybe not 100% directly, but indirectly, I think you definitely saw what the development cycle looks like as a Red Bull second team. So it'll be very interesting to follow, but I think it realistically will come down more so to the drivers than the development path. I think Lawson definitely has the tools to be able to score consistently, but will Lindblad be able to step up and deliver consistently enough, score points enough to help them move up the grid? That I'm a little less sure on, and so it's something we're going to follow for sure. All right, let's talk biggest concerns for 2026. And this one, I think, is the first time we can talk about the potential for the lack of a good car foundation to start an era of regulations as truly being a detriment to a team. With a team with as little experience in developing a car as VCARB has, with a true rookie and basically a full-time sophomore now in Liam Lawson, if they don't have a solid foundation underneath them, will the lack of driver experience be enough to help them develop the car long term? That is something that actually could potentially hold them back. It's going to be very imperative that Red Bull and the Red Bull powertrain be very, very solid to start off with, because I don't know how. I mean, to be fair, I guess I don't know exactly how the development path and leadership looks like at the Red Bull Junior team. But at the same time, with a rookie and a sophomore, they can only give you so much when it comes to developing an F1 car. Throw in the fact that it's the first season on a new era of regulations, they might be just a little bit more out of their depth at the same time, and so it could potentially go from bad to worse. So in terms of concerns, I think that is very much up there across every team on the grid. But kind of piggybacking off of that, most likely failure point if things do go wrong, I think, is obviously the drivers at a team like VCARB. The drivers are definitely going to be the weak points and the pressure points that are going to get pushed on all season long. You have a true rookie and a sophomore in Liam Lawson. It could potentially be a struggle if things go off the rails early. But a counterpoint is, with this being the second team, it's sink or swim at a team like this. And if they swim, it will go very well. Unfortunately, if they sink, it will be just as dramatic. All right, let's talk biggest upside on the other side of the coin. I talked a lot about the potential downsides to having such a young driver lineup. I think actually, if you twist it and squint, turn around 3 times and tilt your head at the right angle, the biggest upside or key strength to a team like VCARB actually could be, while obviously the expectations are still really high, at the same time, they're not being directly put up against someone like Max Verstappen that Isaac Hadjar is going to have to go through this season. And so if it is too much to say that potentially like minorly lower expectations could be a strength, they'll have a little bit more, or I guess less, external pressures outside of the Red Bull program. But of course, that said, it definitely is not necessarily a true case because, as we know, the Red Bull program can be ruthless. And so I think it's such a curious position to be in when it comes to upside, where you're definitely a Red Bull junior, you get called up to the second team, you're obviously expected to jump in and swim immediately, but at the same time, if you have a moment here or there, it's a little easier to sort of get away with it. And so the biggest upside is going to be you're a couple of really low or moderately experienced drivers trying to navigate a new era of regulations. Liam Lawson has never been a part of a regulation change. Arvid Lindblad is going to get his first season in an F1 car and a new regulation change. So even any experience in a previous car of the last couple of years is not necessarily going to translate. So it is going to be very interesting. And so the expectations for the second team are probably actually going to be relatively low. So they could potentially get away with more than we would like to admit. But I think best case performance ceiling as a solid midfield runner, but I think it definitely has a higher chance of potentially airing lower, but we'll cover that in a moment. All right, let's go ahead and talk about one of the harder sections for the VCARB preview that I had, filling out the competitive window and key rivals. I went back and forth a lot on the primary teams that they'll be fighting question, because if I truly think that they're going to take the step back that they are, I think we need to potentially knock them down a handful of pegs. But at the same time, they do have a lot of momentum in terms of Red Bull juniors. And so it's very interesting. So I'm going to stick with a bit of a hedge and say the primary teams that will be fighting will be Haas, Aston Martin, and Audi. The biggest one in there that I have the biggest question marks of is Aston Martin. But at the same time, I am lower, I think, on Aston Martin than potentially a lot of people. And so it's one of those things that it's tough to call, man. It's tough to call. This is one of the questions I spent the longest debating. So I did a bit of a hedge, kind of exactly where they're at, potentially with an air of sliding, maybe just a little bit, but it is what it is. If we talk about their realistic competitive tier, I think this is a midfield car to a T, like the definition thereof, in that I don't think they're truly ever going to be expected to run at the top. I don't think they ever also really expect to truly run at the back. And so it's one of those teams in situations where they're always going to be fighting in the midfield. It's more so, are they going to be fighting up like they saw in 2025, or are they going to be fighting down like we also seen over the last couple of seasons? So it's going to be something to follow for sure. But I think in terms of realistic expectations, I think they'll be a solid midfield team. But it definitely, I think, has a much lower floor than seasons past. So we'll see. And then as for our final question in this section, is 2026 a setup year or a must-deliver year? I think this is very much a setup year. Obviously, you have a effectively complete driver lineup change. You have a full-time driver now in Liam Lawson, as well as bringing up a rookie in Arvid Lindblad. They're reworking the team to once again be a true Red Bull junior team. They're no longer having your Yuki Tsunodas, your Daniel Ricciardos, which have obviously much more extensive Formula One experience. This is going to truly come back down to a Red Bull junior program, and it's going to be a position for drivers to show up and sink or swim, but it is what it is. It's a must-deliver position for the drivers, but, that's what it is all the time. So I think that's kind of realistically what we're seeing in 2026. All right, coming down to it here, let's talk season expectations. In terms of best case scenario for VCARB, I think they continue the momentum that Isaac Hadjar and Liam Lawson were able to conjure up, finishing this high up, and the constructors potentially able to hold on to that momentum. and navigate the era, the regulation change smoothly and continue the momentum forward, potentially even holding about where they were, potentially holding pat exactly where they are, because I think that would be about as ideal a spot for Red Bull for them to finish. When it comes to worst case scenario, I think it is potentially more likely that we see these young drivers struggle a bit more with these new cars and regulations and everything else that goes into developing in a new era of regulations. And they become very inconsistent and potentially become a lot more volatile. I think this will actually be one of the more volatile teams on the grid this season. So I'm looking forward to seeing where they end up, but I think in terms of worst case scenario, they become very, very inconsistent, potentially having even inconsistencies across a single weekend. So, but at the same time, if that's your worst case scenario, there are definitely worse scenarios to be in. Well, when it comes to most likely scenario for VCARB, I think it is definitely going to be a year filled with inconsistencies, probably some weekends with pretty high highs, but also some weekends, probably more so than the others, of pretty low lows at the same time. This is definitely a classic case of a fairly low ceiling or a very low floor with a relatively high ceiling. Obviously, there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to employing these younger drivers, but as we've seen with some rookies in the past, some of them just jump onto the grid and excel from the jump, and others are replaced fairly swiftly, so time will tell. In my expected constructors finishing range, I have them somewhere between 6th and 9th potentially. I think this is a situation where the momentum might carry a little bit, but there'll also be a lot of question marks surrounding the teams around them. This one could come down to just which teams manage to deliver on a given weekend when they're given the opportunity, more so than anything. And then last but not least, our one storyline to follow for 2026 with VCARB, and I think it is the question with all Red Bull juniors that come to the junior team. Will either of the young drivers do enough in 2026 to put pressure on Isaac Hadjar's seat at the main team as he also goes through his 2026 season? It's the case with every single Red Bull Junior. The main storyline that you're going to follow is, will you do enough not only to Red Bull to keep you, but also potentially to make the leap up to the main team? That obviously has more to do with just this team in itself, with the results of the main team also having to take into account. But at the same time, I think it's the main storyline that this team has and probably should have if you're truly going to be the sister team to the main Red Bull team. So it'll be very fun to see where that ends up. And in terms of driver, technical, or organizational focused over the course of 2026, this is definitely a driver-focused year, as I think all VCARB or Red Bull Junior teams should be. It is going to be a fascinating year for VCARB, just because this is going to be the first time in, at least since I've been watching, where Red Bull is truly going to have a relatively very young junior team again. Obviously, Yuki Tsunoda had been there. Since I started watching, he'd been there for a long time. He ultimately got the opportunity to jump up to the main team, but unfortunately didn't make it work. Isaac Hadjar in the junior team for a single season makes the jump up to the main team for 2026. And now we have a couple more young drivers vying for their future at the main team and trying to show everyone on the grid, but more so Red Bull, what they have. Time will tell what we see. But guys, there we have it. Our next three team previews are done and gone. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what these three teams are going to do. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Let me know down in the comment section below. Where do you think these teams are going to finish here in 2026? Stay on the lookout for next week's video, where we're going to be covering Williams, Red Bull, and Ferrari as we continue to march towards F1 preseason testing, as well as our inevitable preseason F1 predictions. I hope you enjoyed these team previews. These are a lot of fun to make. It's a lot of fun to think about these teams and try and predict where they're going to end up in this ever-changing environment in Formula One. If you made it this far into the video, leave a like on the video because it really helps me out and helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We have a lot of fun content planned as we get nearer and nearer to the 2026 season. So I'm looking forward to it more so than anything. And as always, guys, I appreciate you if you made it this far, and I'll see you in the next one.